can you describe the Destiny pan-tumor clinical trial, O2 clinical trial, and specifically which patients were included in the urothelial carcinoma cohort?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Destiny Pan-Tumor 2 was an open-label phase 2 study that evaluated Trastuzumab Deruxtecan across sort of a broad population of patients across different cohorts in solid tumors. I should briefly also summarize that Trastuzumab Deruxtecan is, of course, an antibody-drug conjugate. The well-known Trastuzumab antibody targeting HER2 that is linked to a topoisomerase payload, or a payload that's basically a topoisomerase agent. So this study investigated Trastuzumab Deruxtecan, again, in HER2-expressing solid tumors. So to qualify for this study, patients had to have tumors with HER2 immunohistochemistry expression of 2+ or 3+, so at least that. These were treatment refractory patients with metastatic disease. The study enrolled actually almost 300 patients, so 267 across 7 different tumor cohorts. There was an endometrial cohort, cervical, ovarian, biliary tract, pancreatic, and other cohorts, sort of combining a few rare tumors, and important for our discussion today, a bladder cohort as well. Primary endpoint in the study was objective response rate. And as a reminder, of course, Trastuzumab Deruxtecan already has a more established role in other malignancies, so in breast cancer, gastric cancer, that also have high HER2 expression, and in HER2 mutant lung cancer. And so this was, of course, an attempt to investigate it in other cancers with high HER2 expression. So the primary endpoint, so all patients across all cohorts, objective response rate here was 37%. Importantly, this was enriched in patients with higher HER2 expression. So patients with who had tumors with IHC 3+, there were 75 such patients. So I guess that's a little over about 30% of the population. Response rate there was 61%, so higher than the 37% seen otherwise in all comers. Focusing on the urothelial cohort specifically, as reported in a JCO article, there were 41 patients. In the urothelial cohort, investigator-assessed responses were observed in 39% of those patients. But again, responses were enriched in high HER2-expressing patients. So IHC 3+ patients, response rate was 56%. But then if you actually look at updated results for confirmed objective response rate based on independent central review, and that's really the data that led to FDA approval, and that's in the included basically in the FDA label of this drug. There, the outcomes look a bit different. So for IHC 3+ patients specifically, there were 27 such patients for urothelial cancer, and response rate was 37%. So this is, again, the data that was used to file for the FDA approval and led to the approval of Trastuzumab Deruxtecan in IHC 3+ patients only. And then finally, I mean, I'll just conclude with just a quick overview of adverse events in this trial as well. So in the overall population, the rate of grade 3 and greater adverse events was about 40%. Most common adverse events included cytopenias. That's what's often seen with Trastuzumab Deruxtecan. But one notable adverse event was also drug-related ILD or pneumonitis. So this occurred in about 10% of patients. So it was about 28 patients in the 270 patients trial. Most were low grade, but there were 3 deaths noted from this as well. None of them were in the urothelial cohort, but certainly an important side effect also to pay attention to.
Thank you. That was a nice comprehensive summary of the trial. So again, just to reiterate, the FDA approval in bladder cancer, at least for treatment refractory metastatic urothelial carcinoma, is in the IHC 3+, correct?
Correct. Yeah, and across really across those the solid tumors that were included in
the other cohorts
in this trial. Yeah.
Yep. So something we often see, with breast cancer and other and gastric cancer as well. We come into some issues with how HER2 testing is done. It's a little bit, the IHC is a little bit different depending on which tumor you're talking about. So can you describe how the HER2 testing was performed in the Destiny Pan-Tumor 2 trial? And then maybe after that, what challenges do you anticipate with HER2 testing in urothelial carcinoma since it's not standardized yet in our field?
Yeah. Well, yeah. So that's a great and very relevant question because again, in breast cancer and now actually in gastric cancer as well, HER2 staining is more established, more standardized. A lot of labs and treating facilities will basically do it reflexively. We haven't yet quite gotten there in bladder cancer, but I think with this, particularly with this approval, that's really one of the next important steps and something that we'll be working on. But in this particular study, so the HER2 IHC status was assessed for most patients centrally. For some patients, it was actually assessed locally, so by the site. But central assessment was done using the HER2 Hercept test from Dako. And it was scored according to the ASCO and College of American Pathology guidelines for scoring HER2 specifically in gastric cancer, so rather than breast. And the thinking behind that is that the staining pattern for HER2 does differ across different tumor types. But in bladder cancer, and perhaps in some of these other solid tumors, included in this study in particular, it resembles more the type of staining we see for gastric tumors rather than for breast. So that's at least in part how that decision was made in this trial, and then also how these decisions are made in other trials of HER2 targeting drugs.
Yeah. And then I know you've done work with a lot of, and you're involved in the trials for HER2-directed agents in urothelial carcinoma. Can you describe maybe the prevalence of HER2 expression across urothelial carcinoma from what we understand so far?
Yeah, so that's again becoming a much more relevant question in our field. It was already a relevant question with the ongoing trials. Now with this approval, of course, it's important to actually set the part of the standard of care for patients with metastatic urothelial cancer. And so that is a question we looked at in initially literature review, then retrospective studies as well, and observational studies. And increasingly, what we're seeing is that really the degree of expression of HER2 is greater in urothelial cancer than previously described, sort of greater than we anticipated. Conventionally, I would say high HER2 expression, so IHC 3 plus or 2 plus and a FISH positive is seen in about 15% of advanced bladder cancer tumors. And that's pretty consistent with sort of conventionally what was assumed and what even older trials of HER2 targeting therapies in bladder cancer had estimated. But increasingly, we're appreciating that actually some degree of HER2 expression is present in a much larger proportion of tumors. So probably somewhere between a third and 40%, maybe even a bit higher, have some degree of HER2 expression that doesn't meet these high criteria. So these are basically tumors with IHC 1 plus or 2 plus that are FISH negative. And so altogether, when you put that 33 to 40% with a 15% of high expression, you really get somewhere between 50 and 60% probably of tumors. So maybe you really just over half of patients with advanced bladder cancer that probably have tumors with some degree of HER2 expression that potentially will benefit from HER2 targeting therapies because both in other malignancies like breast and gastric and now in urothelial cancer, from emerging trial data, we are seeing activity even in patients with low expression as defined by immunohistochemistry.
Yeah, that's a great segue into the next question. So we know there's some ongoing trials with disitamab vedotin, which is a HER2 targeting agent, and another trastuzumab deruxtecan in combination with other therapies going on in the frontline setting in urothelial carcinoma. So maybe how does this recent FDA approval of Enhertu and the treatment refractory setting impact the current treatment landscape, and then in the context of these ongoing frontline HER2-directed trials?
Yeah, well, I think this is a very important approval in that it adds another additional targeted therapy basically to our arsenal of for treating patients with metastatic urothelial cancer, right? It's yet another ADC that is approved. So now the third one after enfortumab vedotin and of course trastuzumab deruxtecan. But a notable caveat here, of course, that unlike the other two drugs I just mentioned, in particular, unlike enfortumab, This is available for only a subset of patients. So this is for IHC 3 plus, right? That's the approval. So that's based on the numbers I quoted earlier, that's probably less than 15%.
Mhm.
Right, of all patients with advanced urothelial cancer. It's also available only really in later line of therapy. So these are for patients who really have, probably exhausted, unfortunately, other options. And so realistically, this probably will be a fourth or even a fifth line drug for a minority of patients, right?
Mhm.
So while it may not affect, significant numbers of patients that we can actually treat, I think it's still a very important approval because it really paves the way for additional HER2 targeted therapies that, as you mentioned earlier, are being investigated in urothelial cancer. Importantly, it sets a precedent for testing for HER2 in bladder cancer, right? That's uh, I would say a very important need and something not being done extensively right now that presumably will be done more or should be done more now that there is specifically an approval, and that now that known HER2 status will impact standard of care in metastatic urothelial cancer. So as I mentioned, it does pave the way for additional therapies. There are ongoing trials, as you alluded to earlier, of disitamab vedotin, for instance, another HER2 targeting antibody. So it's a different HER2 targeting antibody, different from trastuzumab, and also a different payload. So it's an MAE payload like enfortumab vedotin. So a very different mechanism of action from trastuzumab. So a pretty different drug, and it is being studied both as monotherapy in treatment refractory patients and in combination with a checkpoint inhibitor with pembrolizumab in frontline, so treatment naive patients. And so we will be getting at least some preliminary data from global trials soon. And of course, there has already been pretty robust data from clinical trials done in China. So based on all this, it really, my hope, our hope, is that novel HER2 targeting therapies will really provide, important treatment options for patients with metastatic urothelial cancer. And this initial approval of Enhertu is just the first step.
I agree. I agree. And then, if disitamab vedotin and, pembrolizumab comes out frontline and as it eventually improved, that may not preclude this since this is using a different payload. So the
Yeah.
more options, the merrier. So
Yeah, and then that's a great comment in that we really with these antibody drug conjugates, right? We really don't have a great understanding right now necessarily how resistance
Mhm.
arises, whether it's due to target downregulation or resistance to payload specifically. So is it the case that yeah, there will be cross
Potentially.
resistance to an
Mhm.
ADC with a similar target or not? Some initial data may emerge in the near future regarding that, but right now we just really don't know. And this just opens up additional, I think, fascinating both clinical and research questions.
Questions. Agree. So the big takeaway here is this is an exciting additional option for a select group of patients with IHC3 plus HER2 expression and treatment refractory metastatic urothelial carcinoma. And really, as clinicians and researchers, the impetus is on us to start testing for HER2 upfront when we send NGS to look for other targetable mutations. So hopefully we can standardize that in the field pretty soon.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would also just add that, yeah, just relationship with your pathologist in this regard is very important, and sort of making them aware, of course, of this. And because that's really probably how it will be done, and how we will move the needle. But yeah, as you very nicely summarized, I think yeah, very, very important first step. And hopefully we will be testing more patients with advanced urothelial cancer for HER2 status.